The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
A very good morning and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for making the time to join us today to discuss this interesting topic of cybersecurity in partnership with one of our member organizations, Control Risk. My name is Meghna Misra Elder, and I lead on the digital innovation and healthcare sectors here at the UK IBC. This is one in a series of webinars we're running. All of the past ones are available on our website, where you will also see our forthcoming events should you wish to join us. We always look forward to your feedback and any suggestions on topics that you may like us to cover in the future. Now, before starting, if I can just take you through some usual housekeeping points. While the session is on, you will be put on mute automatically. So can I please request you to stay on mute to avoid any disturbance? We will start with a presentation, followed by a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the text function on your screen. Also, just so you know that this session is being recorded and we will share it with you in a day or two. Now, moving on to the more interesting stuff. While COVID-19 may have ground most of the world to a halt, unfortunately, we can't say the same for cyber criminals. As our governments are busy fighting the pandemic and managing its impact on our economies, cyber criminals are making the best of this chaos. In the past few weeks, while governments and private organizations throughout the world are taking measures to contain and mitigate this pandemic, which involves accessing, processing, and sharing large amounts of data, we have also seen a spike in cyber attacks. We read about the cyber attack on Honda this morning. Last week, we heard about how the NHS is being targeted by a campaign of cyber attacks. A number of cyber attacks in Switzerland is up to 3 times higher than normal. And there have been similar attacks on the World Health Organization, US Department of Health and Human Services, hospitals and research facilities across the globe. Sharing information openly has obviously prompted us to think about issues like data privacy and legislation, and very importantly, cybersecurity. And now, as we move ahead with relaxing lockdowns and returning to the business as usual, organizations will need to adapt to a very different work environment. This will, of course, require thorough evaluation of the pandemic-driven IT and cybersecurity changes, some of which were, of course, rapidly put in place during the response phase of the pandemic. This needs to be followed by strategic adjustments to existing IT structures, cybersecurity controls, and business processes based on more long-term operating strategies. So in today's webinar, we hope to cover issues like the impact of the pandemic on the cyber threat environment, the information security challenges of remote working and business resumption, the importance of digital transformation in building longer-term resilience, and trends in data security and privacy, and what this means for companies. So without further delay, can I introduce you to our speakers today? Our first speaker is Amit Narayan, who is a partner at Control Risk. He heads the India and South Asia business. Based in Delhi, Amit has supported a wide range of clients on crisis management, executive leadership, brand and reputation impacts of decisions, public policy, labor disputes, and stakeholder mapping. He will be joined by James Owen, who's also a partner at Control Risk. James has worked with Control Risk for 14 years across a range of roles in Russia, India, and is now responsible for their practice in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. In this role, James supports clients to identify cyber threats, develop risk management strategies, and respond to attacks, breaches, and extortion. And our final speaker is Hemant Shivakumar. He is the senior analyst at Control Risk. Also based in Delhi, Hemant is responsible for tier analysis of broader political, economic, and regulatory developments in South Asia, including India. So over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Megha. It's a privilege to be partnering with UK IBC for this session. I add my thanks to Megha's, to each of you who've joined us today for this presentation as well. This is meant to be the start of a conversation. We work extensively with companies similar to yours, helping you plan your path back to recovery, resumption, and for embedding learnings from the challenges we've all gone through as a result of the ongoing global pandemic. Cyber risks are at the top of that pile, and I'd like to hand over to my colleague James Owen to start us off for the day. James?
Thanks very much, Amit, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see the slides on the screen. I won't dwell on who we are because Meghna has done a very good introduction on that front, and I'll move straight on to the subject of the day, which is the impact of COVID-19 on cybersecurity and some of the main trends that we're seeing around that and what that means for recovery planning. So to kick things off, I thought it would be useful to set some context on the current state of the cyber threat landscape. I think it's fair to say that we've seen a really significant uptick in the scale and volume of attacks that we've seen in the threat environment over the last 6 months, going all the way back to January. There's always a correlation between peaks in cyber criminal and nation state activity around events of significant public interest. That could be a sporting occasion, a national holiday, or a major geopolitical confrontation. But what we're seeing right now is that there is a tangible exploitation of the fear and uncertainty around the pandemic that has overflowed into the cyber sphere. We've seen cyber threat actors and their targeting patterns actually very much mirror the spread of the virus geographically around the world over that period. We've seen a weaponization of the pandemic since the first relatively opportunistic phishing lures targeting Chinese organizations were observed all the way back in January, which seems like a lifetime away now, most of which at that point were relatively easy to spot and deployed generally in order to facilitate financial fraud or business email compromise. The tactics actually are not fundamentally different to anything that we've not seen before, but we've seen a massive acceleration in the scale and volume. We've seen COVID-19 themed social engineering laws written now, not just in English, but in local languages to increase the efficiency in click-through rates, malicious mobile apps and websites, targeting of video conferencing platforms, including via registering malicious domains with the names of Zoom or Skype or Microsoft Teams for phishing and to deliver malware. We've seen distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks on government departments, including attacks attributed to state actors, such as the one on the US Department of Health and Human Services back in March. Ransomware, as ever, as a means to compromise networks, remains very much at the forefront of the attack toolkits. We've seen ransomware targeting hospitals in jurisdictions like the Czech Republic, as well as phishing campaigns specifically targeting healthcare workers in countries, again, with the focus on achieving high click-through rates, given the uncertainty behind everything. And disinformation that COVID-19 is linked somehow to the use of 5G or a bioweapon. So in all of this, the real focus for criminals, as ever, is to monetize sensitive data or it's to extort a ransom, meaning we're likely to see more phishing targeting organizations around the pandemic, and also actually more targeting not just of big globally recognizable brands, but small to medium-sized businesses receiving government business loans right now, for example. Outside of healthcare, which has been a really core focus, we've seen criminals also targeting shipping, finance, telecoms, transportation, and importantly, and we'll come back to this point, the supply chain networks that underpin all of these sectors, where your weakest link is often in these situations, not necessarily you and your own infrastructure, but your supplier's supplier. On the nation state side, we've seen states exploiting COVID-19 for disruption, disinformation, espionage and surveillance. We've seen state-linked hackers compromising personal email accounts of WHO employees, most likely to collect intelligence on treatment and response plans, as well as infection rates. And government agencies point very strongly to the fact that nation state actors right now are taking advantage of the uncertainty to establish footholds on critical national infrastructure in other countries, plus of course to acquire sensitive corporate IP and intelligence relating to government policy and vaccine research and development. So there's a lot going on, and this is why maintaining basic information security, hygiene, and securing access to critical data and system resources has been critically important through this period as we move towards resumption and as we all adopt more hybrid home office working models in the future. And this is why maintaining the principle of least privilege, or not opening up access to everything, and putting in place VPNs and multi-factor authentication controls can make a real difference right now. Putting in place controls that actually can help mitigate some of the basic incidents we are responding to now in our response department, and that in many cases the result of these controls not being in place. Nearly all organizations globally have been engaged, as you can see on this slide, in one or more phases of the crisis management lifecycle, whether that's ramping up preparedness or readiness measures, all the way through to full-scale operational response. Our new virtually enabled, data-driven and distributed home working has made us all more connected and accelerated broader trends in digital transformation. But they have also made the response to attacks more complicated. So, for example, teams that once sat next to each other in security operations centers are now working separately or on a rotational basis. Many of the CIOs, CISOs, and security advisors that Control Risk contacted in a recent survey, for example, commented on how the last few months have been one of the most, if not the most, challenging periods in their career. Many of the initial challenges of adapting to our new remote working reality were tactical and logistical. So where IT and security teams were more focused on how they fundamentally provide laptops and two-factor authentication tokens to their staff, or how they get users onto the corporate VPN, but also increase the capacity of the VPN to maintain productivity. But these challenges have slowly been supplemented with more strategic and more existential concerns around how a company can fundamentally plan for cybersecurity when the whole organization has been upended, how an IT and security team can actually keep pace with the rapid rate of change that we're seeing right now, and also what impact cost cutting will have on their ability to embed security and resilience across the organization, and in a way that remains proportionate to the actual threats that they are ultimately facing. From a capacity point of view, we've not seen bandwidth fall over, but networks clearly are under significant strain, and we've seen repeated targeting of telework applications, and IT and security teams have in many cases been fighting a losing battle to both enable this virtual environment, but at the same time turn their attention to the challenges of transitioning employees back onto a corporate network. These teams have also had much less visibility fundamentally across their IT and their OT, or operational technology infrastructure, meaning that in many cases they will be storing up unpleasant surprises for when they finally return to work. And I say will rather than might, because we are already responding to plenty of issues in our response business that have lain undetected for weeks, and indeed even in some cases sometimes months. Another big risk or variable is the fact that our remote working context has put more emphasis on the human factor. We've seen a real blurring of work-life schedules, with music, video content, and homeschooling routines being streamed very often on corporate devices. We've seen information being shared more than usual via personal accounts, and with employees right now much more likely to try workarounds in order to, for example, bypass an issue with a VPN in order to send an important document by email. And this is why maintaining that basic information security hygiene that I mentioned is really crucial. Securing access to resources, making sure you're not opening it up to everyone is important. Securing endpoints or what you plug into your devices is likewise critical. But perhaps most important is actually making sure that your employees are aware of the higher risks that they face at a time like this. So awareness raising is crucial. The most common infection vector remains an employee clicking on a bad link. So these measures can, in a very practical way, reduce vulnerability to attacks targeting, for example, VPNs, remote access solutions, and business critical systems. And this is particularly important at a time when we are moving, albeit at different speeds in various parts of the world, towards the recovery phase in the crisis management cycle. So as we do take probably what is more apt to call baby steps towards that recovery, perhaps towards business resumption rather than full-blown recovery, at least for the next 6 months or so, companies can make life easier for themselves around cyber risk. They should right now, for example, be reviewing their incident crisis management and business resilience plans to ensure that they reflect the hybrid nature of our current, but also our future home and office-based setups. They should also be assessing the readiness and security of their devices and infrastructure, so minimizing, to the extent possible, the risks of plugging our devices back into corporate networks, but also in assessing the readiness of the corporate infrastructure as a whole. These are all really important steps that can be taken to mitigate business resumption risks, but also important to note is the fact that tighter data privacy legislation and more proactive law enforcement around the world is for companies presenting a number of regulatory challenges around how they manage that exposure that they may have been exposed to through attacks or breaches that may have indeed gone unnoticed in the last few months. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Hemant in Delhi to walk through some of the regulatory trends that we're actually observing in India before picking that point up again at a more global level in a few more minutes. So Hemant, over to you.
Thanks, James. Just to give you a little bit of quick context on quick historical context on India's data regulatory environment. If you were an observer 3-4 years back looking into India and looking at the debates on the data regulatory and privacy related issues, you would see the space was largely characterized by, say, civil society activists or the judiciary, for instance, and to a very less extent the government. In 2017, you had the Supreme Court actually pass a landmark ruling where it upheld privacy as being a fundamental right to be guaranteed by the Constitution. The federal government on the back of it then set up a committee to probe and look into and establish a framework to put together a data privacy law. But that's where that part of the story ends. In 2018 and 2019, what's really characterized the data regulatory environment in India is a discernible shift in from the political perspective of things. So much so that you've in fact had the Prime Minister Narendra Modi going to the US and talking about data as being the new oil, as you can see here, and new oil and data being the new gold, in fact. And that's largely the shift that is likely to drive a lot of trends on the data regulatory environment in the coming years as well. While there are issues that the government considered on the back of the Supreme Court ruling and looked at the GDPR and various other legislations, but what we've seen as far as the data privacy bill that was recently introduced in the parliament and is still to be passed as an act are issues around like data localization and data transfer related problems, things that have significant impact on businesses that the government is likely to heighten its intervention. And these are some of the issues that we'll unpack in the coming slides as well. The second major transformation or rather development that's been happening is on the cybersecurity front, with the government keen to pass what is called the National Cybersecurity Strategy. This was supposed to be released in February 2020, but what we assess at this point of time is both these elements. One is India's data privacy law as well as the cybersecurity strategy are likely to have a little bit of overlaps, but as things goes on and they will continue to generate compliance risks for companies, given that, and especially considering that India's data regulatory environment is still something that needs to pick up over the coming years. James, if you could move on to the next slide. I'd probably illustrate this best with an example of the government's contact tracing app, Arogya Setu, that was launched soon after the national lockdown that was announced in March. So the government put forth this app, and it claimed that it would help state governments, all of India's 28 states, to really improve the way that they contain the pandemic through better contact tracing efforts. but right from the time that the app was launched, I mean, although it did see a huge number of downloads, about more than 10 to 15 million downloads, there has been significant scrutiny over the government's approach to this app. It's largely over the fact that the app itself is being run by a volunteer group that's been handpicked by the government. The data resides on a server that's government run, but that's not verifiable by independent sources. Scrutiny started growing around this app so much so that the government, in fact, in recent days has has in fact made the app open source. The other damning aspect to these developments have also been on how things have been playing out operationally, with several state governments actually not making use of this app at all, and to the extent of junking this, because state governments have taken slightly more evolved positions on their rules and their procedures. So one of the key characteristics of what we're seeing under COVID-19 in India is the federal and state relations being frayed. And this is also likely to play out in the operational environment as far as the data regulatory and privacy issues are concerned, and even in terms of like handling cybersecurity issues in the coming months as well. Which brings me to my next slide on what does the regulatory enforcement environment actually look like for businesses, and what are some of the key issues that you could be watching out for. Given the evolving, the super fluid state of affairs as far as the pandemic related developments are concerned, what we're likely to see is a data regulatory legislation is unlikely to be the last word. On paper, the government could pass a legislation, but the devil will be in the details, such as the rules that the government will explain, or so much so that it could possibly also not consider passing formal legislation, and it could just pass on the responsibility of establishing rules to a plethora of state and federal regulators in terms of how data privacy and data regulation needs to be handled. And we are already seeing this play out in practice. The second major development is, and this goes back to my initial point about talking about data as being the new oil, is the government's commercial approach towards looking at data privacy and data integrity as well. We are already seeing this play out as far as data localization issues are concerned. For example, you had the Central Bank of India in 2018 asked several key financial firms and foreign financial firms to actually set up local data servers within India on literally like a 2 weeks notice, despite several objections to the kind of like overnight decision. Foreign companies had to comply with that. Such instances are likely to play out in the coming months as well. Although there is no overarching data legislation, the government is likely to possibly encourage foreign companies to set up local data centers in India. It's also taking a significantly political turn. The government is talking about economic nationalism. So what this means in terms of playing out is the government will look at looking at data localization and establishing data centers to do that as a job creating opportunity. So there's a very political angle to how the data regulatory environment will play out in the coming months as well. The different regulators that will possibly oversee how these issues are implemented also bring with it a set of issues in terms of and institutions in India to a large extent continue to be very personality driven. So for instance, you could have someone come in and the federal government's data protection authority that is envisioned in the privacy bill, and it could be they could possibly start enforcing newer compliance rules, or you could have someone who's a political appointee who's happy to not do anything significantly transformative as well. So you also likely to have that element play in it. The kind of like last major development that will characterize this space is that of enforcement. There have already been we have been hearing a lot of stories about how companies, foreign companies as well, have been approached by the government in terms of seeking access to data through backdoors. I'd also like to draw attention to broader point of national security around here. Say, for instance, like you're a firm that has local servers in China and local servers in India as well. There is the possibility that the geopolitics between India and China can very well play into how the government enforces additional scrutiny on your firm as well. And we to some extent seeing that happening, and this might not necessarily be covered by the legislation, but this could be beyond the legislation and driven specifically by regulators and specific regulatory bodies as well. Which brings me to my final point before I hand it over to James in terms of the stakeholder environment. At this point, I mean, the diagram actually seems quite clear, but it can very quickly descend into chaos if not really implemented well. So you have like overarching themes here and several state and federal agencies looking at cybersecurity related aspects and data regulatory aspects that will come into the picture in the coming months as well. And therefore, what you're likely to see is significant overlap between these different firms, and without additional clarity on how the government actually tries and enforces this, or without additional clarity around issues of how this is likely to play out, it is likely to be very difficult for firms. It will generate additional compliance and operational risks. I mean, for instance, one of the classic questions that is ongoing currently is there is a data breach, and firms do go and report that to the local law enforcement authorities. But with the data protection with the data regulator coming into federal data regulator coming into the picture, you're also likely to have that much more scrutiny over firms to have it reported to the data regulator as well, without clarity on who's actually likely to conduct follow-up action. But this is still evolving as we speak. So I'll pass it back to you, James, for.
Great, thanks, Hemant. So I think a lot of those trends that we're actually seeing in India underpin broader global trends that we're seeing more generally. So I think the move towards data privacy as a whole reflects, in essence, the shift that we've seen in the power balance from bulk data collection and surveillance to data privacy and consumer rights. GDPR in Europe is probably the best example of this, and you can see how that is influencing legislation in India, but also in places like Brazil, the Middle East, and most recently via the California Consumer Privacy Act in the United States. But this trend isn't universal. The emphasis, for example, of the Chinese cybersecurity law on data localization and on controls on cross-border data transfers is forcing companies doing business there to map their data flows and supply chain exposure, often with really big implications for their operating models. And this is where this mainly differs with GDPR in the notion of proportionality, which in Europe allows for exceptions based on criteria such as the data subject's consent and risk management. And more broadly, it also echoes some of the changes that we're seeing increasingly, where countries are looking to create sovereign internets cut off from the rest of the web, which fundamentally tests the open vision with which the internet was originally founded. Complicating this, the backdrop of global trade disputes, the rise of protectionism, has also shown how many countries are taking more steps than ever before to curtail the use of technologies that are owned, controlled, or subject to the laws of foreign adversaries. So we've seen that with the US ban on China's Huawei, and likewise in China's drive to become technologically autonomous, no longer dependent on a US tech supply chain base. COVID-19 in many ways is actually accelerating a lot of these trends, with many global companies seeking to move production closer now to their consumer base, and particularly in sectors like pharma and medical services. So given this backdrop, it's probably worth stressing that despite, I guess, that broader regulatory and indeed supply chain fragmentation that we're starting to observe, we are living through a period of really ubiquitous global connectivity. As the chart on this slide shows, we're seeing a proliferation in IoT, or Internet of Things devices, that will overtake non-IoT connections next year. The computerization of everything from cars to medical devices, homes, factories, cities, it's not going anywhere, and it's here to stay, despite the collision of public and private sector interests that we're increasingly seeing with governments keen to erect digital boundaries increasingly, but private companies keen to ensure seamless connectivity. And it's this interconnectedness that is being accelerated by trends in automation, artificial intelligence, and cloud infrastructure, amongst other advancements, all of which present huge opportunities for organizations, but do also form the basis of a digital landscape that makes us more interconnected and thus more exposed than at any time before, making it more important than ever that an organization fine-tunes its risk management strategy to navigate these shifting digital, political, and regulatory tides. This is, in effect, why we are seeing more companies increasingly blend their physical and cybersecurity functions, merging once siloed structures to reflect the growth of attacks on systems whose disruption now leads to a direct physical impact. And it's also a reminder why cyber risk is not a topic that should just be siloed within an IT department, but one that at its heart is a security, compliance, and resilience issue, especially at a time like this. So on that, I will hand over to Amit.
Thank you, James. Just like to close off with a few observations, which both kind of reiterate some of the points that James and Hemant made, but also just kind of bring home a few key considerations for companies that are operating in India and in the UK. COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of the key technology, business, professional, and work-life related trends that we were already seeing emerge in our lives and work. In the same way, it has also exacerbated the risks and threats that companies face. If you look at insider risk, every single study since 2016 and even earlier, I didn't want to go further back, suggests that over 50% of cyber threats to an organization come from malicious or careless employees. And despite that, there are only about 50% of business leaders across multiple global studies who realize this, and less than half that number have a plan in place to manage, train employees, and effectively address and neutralize that threat. This risk is exploited by the fear and uncertainty caused by COVID. As James mentioned, having a plan to manage some of these risks, the way that social engineering is being used, ruses, malicious websites, etc., is one of the first things that companies have to do when, but also especially when they resume and recover as part of the learnings from COVID-19. The second point is on digital transformation. Once again, James addressed this. As with us and most other firms, having firmly and formally adopted technology to manage their businesses, data will take center stage, has taken center stage. And as Hemant mentioned, as regulators track it and competitors want it, your data should be used by you to inform and drive your business strategies. This transformation will be as much about new skills and tools as it will be about cultures and behaviors. And not being able to use this opportunity to appropriately kind of give data and analysis of data and analysis of trends the rightful place that it deserves in your business strategy would be an opportunity lost. New ways of working will need companies to redefine policies, governance mechanisms, roles and responsibilities. Work from home, as an instance, will have to be formally written into employment contracts and codes of conduct documents, which means capturing attendance, doing timesheets, remote access, cybersecurity, VPN, server access, cloud access, all the way to business continuity and disaster recovery, all of which James referenced, will need to be considered formally now with output and rewards to be administered as a consequence. Training and awareness about social engineering, we spoke about already, but just that will not suffice. It'll be about drills, simulations, test emails that have to become a regular part of the process within your organization. Simple things like town halls across a regional organization will not just be about 20 officers logging on. It'll be technologically tenuous with hundreds of individual remote workers potentially logging on. And many of us in our IT departments and business leaders have faced that over the last 3 or 4 months. Are we ready for that? That's the question worth asking. From an outside-in perspective, cybersecurity assessments have to become more continuous, have to be more about continuous monitoring and rolling assessments. Annual audits and occasional patches cannot be the solution. They seem to have worked thus far or barely, but no more. Again, as James mentioned, as IoT adoption and automation of business processes scales up, the greater will be the vulnerabilities. And these risk control matrices have to be established, deviations have to be captured, local, regional, global, and then mapped into the company's overall operational compliance and technology risk areas. Regulatory compliance, I think we spent a little bit of time talking about that, as Hemant alluded to, specific to India, but there are kind of broader implications as regulatory and legal picture becomes more complicated, becomes more fractured. Companies will find it difficult to estimate exposure, and law enforcement will become unpredictable. Weaponization of cyber resources, James mentioned, rise in data nationalism, the use of data as a tool for not just exerting national identity, but also foreign policy. These have implications for how multinational companies will collect, store, and manage data. And finally, most companies still do not have a 100% foolproof list of all the vendors who access your IT systems. We spoke about the dangers not just coming from within your organization, but your suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers. And the more broadly spread your business is, the more complicated your business value chain is, regardless of whether you're looking to reorganize that and make it simpler and bring it closer home. The worse the situation will be. The more touch points there are, the more weak links you create. CNF agents, we've had clients whose CNF agents have access all the way into your ERP system to log inventory and sales, but who don't quite know if those agents have secure Wi-Fi or if their server is firewalled properly. So third-party compromises are actually the second biggest source of cyber compromises after insiders, and reviewing and monitoring your partners is now going to be even more critical. So just as a kind of closing thought, your data can be your biggest asset. But without a plan to capture, store, secure, analyze, and transmit it, and to allow for surveillance and allow for regulatory access to it, it could also become your biggest liability. And conducting and having a very robust approach to cyber due diligence and resilience mapping to ensure that you track the key weak points and threat factors is what a smart business manager is doing. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you and your questions.
Thanks, Amit. Thank you. And thank you, all three of you, for this brilliant and insightful presentation. Just to sort of summarize that very briefly, cyber attacks have gone up as they do due to situations like this. COVID has obviously accelerated digital transformation, as James mentioned, but also, as Amit mentioned, exacerbated the risk. So I think going forward, organizations need to think about the new work structures and adapt their cybersecurity strategies accordingly. You mentioned ensuring security and resilience, so revising strategies, the readiness of corporate infrastructure, including their IT devices or IT infrastructure, creating awareness, redefining policies. I think training staff is really, really important. And I think most importantly, cyber framework needs to be a part of basic company culture. And I think government also has a very important role to play, not just designing appropriate regulation, but beyond designing, it's about implementation and enforcement. And as Hemant said, devil is always in the detail. So those are just some key points that I've noted, but I think we've got quite a few interesting questions here, some of which you've already touched upon, but I think if we can just go on in more detail. One of the things is very briefly, you mentioned what have been the main challenges during this time faced by businesses and governments. Hemant, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Meghna. I mean, so in terms of cyber attacks, I mean, like as James and Amit have pointed out, there have been the three major vectors in which this has happened. So one is you've had attacks on most of the established firms, and this is both private as well as government firms during the pandemic. In fact, there was a private study conducted which said about like 37 to 40% increase in the number of attacks between March to April on private firms as well as like government state-owned enterprises and government bodies as well. The second major segment has been that of small-scale and medium-scale industries, most of which have kind of like been a little shortchanged, and they've tried scaling up their presence online and then tried to use different digital platforms. Much of the attacks on them have been quite debilitating in terms of the amount of data leaks or financial related frauds as well. And the third broader segment has been in terms of normal citizens, the financial frauds against them as well. So all of these have registered a significant uptick. But this also brings us to the broader aspect of typically there have been, and now when you're looking at the Indian government, there are like three entities that you're looking at. One is concerns around that deals with concerns around like information technology related issues. One that deals with cybersecurity related problems, and the third, which is still evolving, is that of the data regulatory issues. And more often than not, there has not been significant overlap between and significant exchange between these three kind of like entities, which comprise of several sub-entities in themselves. And most of these attacks have kind of like brought that aspect to the core. So while like a few months ago, and talking about the national cybersecurity strategy that was in completely different lines, I think the government would revisit that. And given how several businesses are actually moving online, and it cuts across from your micro enterprises to medium to small scale to even the bigger firms, and likely to increasingly use their online presence to leverage things, the government will have to kind of like go back to the drawing table and get these three entities together before they get something coherent out. And again, there are both opportunities and risks in that, and some of the main risks there are clearly issues for businesses in terms of compliance and operational elements that are likely to play out. But I think this will kind of like and the government will look to consolidate these different segments before they come up with something concrete.
Brilliant, thanks for that. James, if I can just come to you, you mentioned the importance of digital transformation. What do you mean by that, and how can that help companies through the resumption recovery phase now?
Yeah, thanks, Meghna. I mean, it's a good question, and it's one of those terms, just like cyber, actually, that means different things to different people. It's quite nebulous. I mean, at its heart, a lot of people define it as kind of the process of kind of adopting technology to kind of innovate and to drive kind of strategic growth. I would actually define it above and beyond the technology element as really building in the skills, the culture, and the data insights into a company in a way that can help to build resilience. And actually, anecdotally, over the last 6 months in our daily conversations with clients, what has become most apparent is that those that have invested in some level of automation, in digital transformation across their global IT and OT infrastructure are the ones that have actually been most resilient, kind of transitioned to this kind of new virtualized way of working most efficiently, and are probably best placed for dealing with the kind of more hybrid model that we're all going to be moving towards in the future. And so it is a way of driving growth, digital transformation, but it's also a really important way of building those skills and data insights in your company to help you actually ensure that you are growing in a secure way, in a compliant way, given that backdrop that I mentioned around a much more expanded attack surface. So that kind of we're seeing the contrast between fragmentation in the regulatory space, but we're seeing at the same time much more kind of consistency in the sophistication and level of attacks globally from criminals and nation states, all exploiting a much broader, kind of more connected attack surface. So that's why digital transformation is important, and can be frankly a kind of a way that a company remains relevant, not just to its customers, but also kind of stays in existence in the next kind of few years.
Sure, thanks. I've got one more question here. I don't know which one of you would like to take this, but how can employers ensure that their staff and data remain safe when they're home working?
I guess I can take that as well. I mean, I think it's kind of really around some of the points that I made about making sure that you're putting really basic information security hygiene in place. So I'm not undermining what I just said around digital transformation. That is absolutely critical, but really ultimately this all starts with user behavior, whether you're at home or whether you're in the office, and that is about making sure that you are accessing information in the right way, that you are utilizing VPNs, multi-factor authentication, that you're not sticking things into your devices that you shouldn't be, that you're aware of who else might be kind of accessing, including your children, your devices. It all starts with user behavior, and it's a little bit more prosaic, but ultimately that is the last line of defense, but also probably the area where organizations should focus most in terms of awareness raising.
Sure, thanks. It's one for you, Amit. And yes, we've touched upon this before as well. What key changes do you see happening as a result of this pandemic?
What key change? Megha, I'd actually kind of take on from where James left off about the importance of user behavior and companies training for it and building awareness and so on and so forth. In essence, if there is one thing that we are already seeing companies change, and which we urge pretty much every one of our clients to do, is to become a lot more proactive, in fact, even preemptive about the way that they look at cyber. Cyber threats and cybersecurity and cyber response is actually going to be almost business critical, or is not almost, is going to be business critical. It could fundamentally compromise your ability to do business. And that, what does that mean in real life? It means that law firms are a lot more proactive about running tests that ensure that they're not going to be compromised by ransomware or malware. It means telecom companies are urging their subscribers to change login details so that their mobile phones don't get compromised. It means banks have to change their credit cards of customers proactively rather than waiting for them to be stolen online. Because there's a very real threat that the dark web, or indeed even the the online world offers, and it's very important for companies and the company's customers to stay ahead, one step ahead, and the only way to do that is to be proactive and preemptive. Training people to become more vigilant and aware requires companies to kind of act in that way, because it's only when you act proactively do your employees take from that and then learn, and that's how behavior and culture is changed.
Fantastic. I think you've summed it up quite well, isn't it? What to take away from this was summed up really well in that answer. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground here. And just looking at the time, I just want to throw one more question. If there are any other last thoughts from either of you, James, if I can just start with you.
So I think it would just be to repeat one or two of the key messages. Firstly, around the need for organisations to really double down on making sure that employees are aware of the kind of the main do's and don'ts. Never underestimate the importance of kind of good practical information security hygiene, but also actually perhaps on a slightly more optimistic and aspirational note, for organizations to really prioritize how digital transformation in a tangible way can both build resilience, but also allow them to ride the waves that we are likely to continue seeing across the global business, political, and operating landscape in the future, not least given some of the impact that we've seen of COVID and the broader issues around protectionism on global supply chains, and how companies can remain really agile and digitally agile in responding to some of those changes. So I would just kind of focus on those two.
That's brilliant. Just on that, there's one more question which basically says, what's the best practice to have top management engagement and investment into cybersecurity while we're all facing financial difficulties and financial constraints?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So just like in the kind of just like in corruption for the arena for the last kind of 30 years or so, tone from the top is really, really crucial. So kind of making sure that kind of senior management buy-in to that process is really critical. But I think above all, recognizing that there are real pressures at the moment on cost control, on kind of budgets, but making sure that you're not losing sight of the fact that whilst security budgets, for example, might be cut and that may have an impact, you just need to be even more targeted in the way that you go about prioritizing your really critical system, not trying to defend against the indefendable, but actually really trying to protect what is most critical to you as an organization, and ensure that you're really also improving your ability to respond and recover, rather than perhaps invest huge amounts of money in detection, to ensure that you actually can remediate quite quickly, or perhaps more quicker than you otherwise would have been, out of the kind of issues that arise from a typical cyber attack or incident. So I would just make those points.
Great, thanks. Hemant, was there anything you wanted to add to that? I think you're
Sorry,
on mute.
didn't realize I was on mute. Yeah. No, I was just going to say that I mean, one of the issues that will characterize kind of like strategic decisions at this level is also, as we move along, increasing government intervention in this space, which will and both positive and negative consequences, which will also mean that organizations will need to kind of see this coming and plan adequately for this. I mean, in terms of the positive bits, the government has at times in the past acknowledged, I mean, as far as in India is concerned, that there is a capacity constraint. So it has been happy to have the private sector come and advise and kind of like set some broad guidelines and rules as far as the information and the data environment is concerned as well. So you're likely to see strands of that, but increasingly as the government looks at commercializing, looking at things from a commercial angle, you're likely to see different manifestations of government intervention, which is something that organizations should think about from the broader point of view if they're entering into markets like India.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So basically, we're saying that we should consider this as a test. A test of what has been happening, how have we been looking at cybersecurity or data regulation, and learning from it, and then revisiting and revising our strategies, our policies, and embedding it in our corporate culture. That is the key message coming out of this. I think it's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so very much, Amit, Hemant, and James, for sparing the time to come and share your knowledge and information with us. And I hope all of our audience has found it interesting as well. If there are any questions that we haven't answered, then do please feel free to send them through to us. We will share these with Amit, Hemant, and James and try and get back to you. And like I said, if you've missed any bit of this webinar, then it's available on our website, so you can go and visit us. Thank you so very much for your time today.